Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the program. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. We'll cross live to Tel Aviv as the situation escalates. Hamas threatening to kill hostages, with Gaza now under a total blockade. I'll get an update on how the nation at war is responding. We'll talk to Mr. Mark Sofer, who was at one time Israel's ambassador in Australia. Despite the fallout from the Hamas terror attacks dominating politics here and abroad, the Voice decision, of course, that day is closing in. More legal minds today call out this fiction that the PM's proposal is a modest one. We'll talk to one of those experts tonight on fears of what will come if the Voice passes. Plus, how on earth did the New South Wales Police and the Minister get it so wrong, arresting peaceful Jewish Australians last night while letting pro-Palestine, or rather anti-Jewish protests, spew hate and violence at our iconic Opera House? Truly disgusting scenes, made worse, of course, by the authorities who let not just us down, but Australia's Jewish community. And speaking of the impact on Jewish Australians, how has the Prime Minister not held a national security meeting? Yet we hear reports of Jews afraid to show their faith in public, a point the opposition leader was right to point out today.
I find it remarkable that the Prime Minister hasn't held a national security meeting yet. I mean, the threat to people of Jewish faith in our country is very real. There are stories coming out of Jewish communities where they're telling their kids not to wear their school uniforms in public.
But first, last night's pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas protests in Sydney showed shockingly poor judgment by the New South Wales Police, a lack of any preparedness by the New South Wales government to deal with a very foreseeable likelihood of protests like this, especially after what we saw in Greenacre in Sydney on Sunday night, and confirmation this afternoon that the Opera House protest did not even have a police permit. Well, it's all a damning indictment of the Minns government and ministers asleep at the wheel.
Well, I think everybody needs to just calm down and, as you say, do stay at home. This sort of dividing into camps and barracking over what's a horrific situation in the Middle East is just not acceptable. What everybody needs to do is to show restraint and respect and calm down. And
what's the point in lighting up the sales of the Opera House and then telling Jewish people to stay home for their own safety?
I think all people should stay home for their own safety if the streets are unsafe. But
is New South Wales and Sydney unsafe?
Well, I'm confident that the police have got the streets under control, as they always do.
Worse still, this whole past 72-hour period has exposed some of the fault lines in modern Australia. Now, whatever some might think about Israeli government policy or past history in this ancient part of the world, the actions of Hamas, the deliberate and systematic slaughter of innocents, and the callous taking of hostages to be used as human shields, well, we should all condemn that because it is simply evil. Yet, as you saw here last night, a prominent Sydney Muslim cleric was revelling in these atrocities.
I'm smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage.
Until very recently, that man shared a stage with our Prime Minister. And then last night, those very ugly scenes, a pro-Palestine rally, but let's call it what it is, anti-Israel, anti-Jew, pro-Hamas rally that moved its way from the Sydney City Town Hall down to the Opera House with hundreds of protesters chanting against Israel and spewing racist slurs against Jewish Australians. Now, initially, when I saw those images last night, I was staggered that a protest like this was approved by the police, given the hate and the violence at its core. Why allow it, I thought? Why allow it move from the town hall and down to the Opera House, which was bathed in blue and white light in a show of solidarity for the people of Israel? How did it happen, I asked? Where were the ministers, the police chiefs? Because blind Freddie could have anticipated, after those scenes on Sunday night, that more anti-Israel crowds were likely. Well, this afternoon we discover that last night's Opera House protest was not a legal protest. It was not approved by police. Here's the New South Wales Police Minister, Yasmin Credlin, under pressure in State Parliament today.
The police did not approve a march. The process for avoiding protest meetings or marches, known as Form 1, generally takes about a week to complete. There was no Form 1 for this event. After the horrific events in Israel on the weekend, police were closely monitoring the situation and became aware through intelligence and through social media that large numbers could be expected to gather in the city. They needed to manage a highly volatile crowd, and again I say, last night they did that successfully.
Now, the police minister is kidding herself. First up, as I reported to you here last night when the news broke, the idea that New South Wales police can tell Jewish Australians to stay at home but they can't guarantee their safety on the streets, well, that's intolerable. It cannot be accepted as a new norm in this country. And secondly, if a protest is illegal, if it has no authorisation, then why did the police stand by as they sent up flares and spewed their hate? If the protest is illegal, then lock up the protesters. But that's not what happened, is it? The protesters were able to take over the forecourt at the Opera House and forced Jewish Australians out of Sydney. Not all of them. One man, a businessman, a father of two, Mark Spiro, who turned up with his Israeli flag, hoping to show solidarity with his homeland, was confronted by police and he was arrested. Afterwards, Spiro was released by police after his flag was confiscated, and he agreed to staying out of the city for the next 24 hours.
I was literally at the protest for all of probably 3 seconds, literally, with a rolled up Israeli flag, and next thing I know I've got multiple police officers trying to grab the flag off me and then carrying me away from the scene and telling me I'm arrested for breach of the peace, but it was excessive, and at the time having both your arms pinned back for effectively having a rolled up Israeli flag was shocking and confronting, and then being dragged like that, I felt like a rag doll. I'm not a violent person. The people that we are supporting and allowing a platform to celebrate the murder, rape, abduction of children, women, the elderly, are allowed to desecrate one of our most famous sites.
New South Wales Police Command tried to say today that he was arrested for his own safety.
A person was removed from the town hall rally who was carrying a flag for his safety. He was arrested to prevent a breach of the peace for his safety. He was removed and released.
And yet those responsible for the illegal, unauthorised protests calling for the extermination of Israel, death to Jews, even the horrific gas the Jews, were able to go right ahead. Just a warning, the following clip may well be distressing to my viewers. There they are, no intervention from police, no one locked up, no one reprimanded, flares going off and more. We know they did not have a permit, that these protests were illegal, and yet one person arrested. Just the peaceful Jewish man with his flag. How is it all right for protesters to chant those Palestinian slogans, spew their anti-Israel hate and wave the Palestinian flag, but not for another to wave the Israeli flag? All too often, police are too focused on keeping the peace and not enough on enforcing the law. Ever since Saturday, I've heard and read too much that's ignorant and ill-informed about the events that unfolded in Israel. On the facts of what happened at the hands of Hamas, there is no moral equivalence. There is no moral equivalence between organised, well-planned, well-funded terrorism against innocent civilians and the right of a country to protect its borders, its people, and to strike back at terror groups and their leaders. And Australians, regardless of their ethnic background, should be capable of making that distinction. Now, I get the natural interest and sympathy that exists between Australians of Middle Eastern background for the places they've left behind. But it's Australia's national interest that should be foremost and uppermost in their minds, not the animosities that we presume they came to this country to leave behind. The protection and preservation of Israel as a bastion of freedom in a dangerous part of the world is an important national and global interest. Likewise, a less medieval Islam, shorn of its death to the infidel extremism, is a vital national interest. Australia should always stand resolutely against any ideology that promotes hatred based on race or religion. The danger, though, is that some recent migrants might regard themselves in this case as Palestinians resident in Australia rather than Australians of Palestinian background. And we've long valued the cultural richness and diverse migrant backgrounds that people bring to Australia, but only if they leave their old hatreds behind. It'd be good now to hear urgent voices from leaders of Middle Eastern communities in Australia demanding calm, regretting the Israeli dead as well as the Palestinians, and accepting that it's quite right for Australia to support Israel once more under deadly threat. Support Israel as every Australian should, as the world should. All right, let's go to Canberra for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has called out his Attorney-General after Michael Daly called on Sydney's Jewish community to stay at home in the wake of pro-Palestinian protests.
I want to make it clear that I don't support those comments. I will be speaking to the Attorney-General today. I think there's a false equivalence when you're speaking about the Jewish community in New South Wales that want to come together in solemnity in relation to the barbarism that we've seen in Israel over the last 48 hours.
Mr Daly sparked a backlash after he admitted not being across the ugly scenes that unfolded on the Opera House steps, where pro-Palestinian protesters uttered anti-Semitic slurs and burned Israeli flags.
They knew this protest was going to happen. They knew there was a protest happening at the town hall, and they did absolutely nothing to stop the mob marching through the city up to the Opera House.
The Prime Minister and opposition leaders say they're horrified by the actions of attendees.
I've now seen the images just recently, and they're horrific, quite clearly. Slogans which are anti-Semitic and just appalling with no place.
People can protest peacefully. That is a right. People can express their view, even if we disagree with it in our country. But some of the conduct last night was appalling, and frankly, there should have been a lot more done to deter that gathering from taking place in the first instance.
The New South Wales opposition has criticised the Minns government's response, as well as Labor MP Mark Butterleague for failing to distance himself from his son's attendance.
We see the most disgusting display of anti-Semitism that one could imagine. Obscene slogans, the lighting of flames, the burning of a flag, all happening on the doorstep of our most famous location in Australia.
Anthony Albanese has accused Peter Dutton of playing politics after the opposition leader questioned why the National Security Committee hasn't held a meeting about the escalating conflict in Israel. As DFAT scrambles to account for the welfare of 10,000 Australian citizens in Israel, the opposition leader says the Prime Minister needs to be doing more on the ground here in Australia to protect the Jewish community on home soil.
I find it remarkable that the Prime Minister hasn't held a national security meeting yet. I mean, the threat to people of Jewish faith in our country is very real. There are stories coming out of Jewish communities where they're telling their kids not to wear their school uniforms in public.
I just think it's very disappointing that we have an issue like this and Peter Dutton is looking for a political angle here.
The Prime Minister did not confirm whether a NSC meeting has been convened. New polling has revealed that Labor MPs, including Linda Burney, have failed to sway the majority of their own electorates to vote yes ahead of Saturday's Voice referendum. Only 3 MPs on Labor's frontbench can claim majority support for the Voice in their electorates, 5 days out from voting, while others, such as Treasurer Jim Chalmers and Defence Minister Richard Marles, are facing no majorities in their seats.
It's a long week, isn't it? It's only Tuesday. A lot to get through tonight. Let's bring in Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Andrew, those scenes in Sydney, they're not pro-Palestine rallies. They were pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, anti-Jew rallies. Shocking scenes. I think the government there is condemned. They've been caught flat-footed. I think particularly the police minister needs to reconsider her future. But I am surprised that given there was no permit granted for this rally, that the police allowed it to move from the Sydney Town Hall to a point where they knew, would have to have known, given the sails were lit up in the Israeli flag colours, that there would be a potential for confrontation. What happens now?
Well, I think it's just an opportunity missed. I mean, they're not lighting it up again. There doesn't seem to be much of a suggestion anyone will be arrested from the rally. I believe there's a rally on soon in Melbourne. I think
there is.
It's a bit of a fingers crossed situation at the moment in Australia. It's a bit like walking on eggshells, Peter, and you've got to hope the authorities are prepared and that they learn from last night as well.
Yeah, I might remind people at home, though, Hamas is a listed organisation. So if anyone turns up with a flag or signage or Arabic writing or anything identified with Hamas, that's an offence for which you could get arrested. I would presume we've got intelligence agencies trawling through attendees at these events and things that might have been said online. But surely there's got to be some fallout here for the New South Wales government, for the police minister, indeed for the senior command.
Oh, look, I think there is. I don't doubt there is. And there's state racial vilification laws in play as well. So the police could look at that. But from what I've heard, the police basically didn't say to Israelis, don't go, but they said to the Jewish Board of Deputies, there's risk in going. And then what option did the Jewish Board of Deputies have except to say to their community, maybe you shouldn't go? So it is...
Well, hang on, they arrested that bloke. They arrested Mark Spiro.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
They arrested him and they told him it was for his own safety.
It does appear a bit of a mess, and certainly not helped by Michael Daly's incompetence, which he showed. So it was almost like Chris Minns. I think he was off yesterday, but spent most of the day on the phone because of all this. And he really had to pull his ministers into line today. So he has to coordinate now with the police a better way, because that just simply wasn't good enough. It's like the bad guys win again.
Mm. I made the point about this commentary in some sections of the media about moral equivalency. We've seen it with the Greens. We saw it with Sonny Bill Williams trying to make a point on Twitter that the Hamas actions were akin to the freedom fighters in Ukraine. Peter Dutton addressed this at his press conference today. Have a listen.
Anybody who seeks to try and compare Israel to Hamas here, and somehow there's a moral equivalence, it's completely wrong thinking. What we're seeing here, as I said earlier, is not a rudimentary incursion across a border by an individual in a matter that's dealt with. This is a terrorist attack.
I think Penny Wong's been weak with her restraint response, which she backed in again yesterday. But two Labor frontbenchers, Chris Bowen and Tony Burke, both have quite significant Arab populations in their electorates. They've got radio silence out on this issue. Surely they should have to front and make very clear their position.
Well, they'll come under pressure to do so from the media story on it this afternoon. I've got no doubt about that. There'll be an opportunity in Parliament next week in relation to that, I guess. There's no question that Labor has a bit of an issue, or perceives a bit of an issue in terms of offending the Palestinian community. And you saw it when Bob Carr was Foreign Minister, and some of it even relates to the fact that the Labor leadership ballot, the Labor left, are on the Palestinian side. But I just think anyone, even if they have sympathy for the treatment of Palestinians over decades, can't do anything but condemn what happened over the weekend. It's an open and shut case. They basically found women and children, and there was rape, torture and killing of innocents who didn't have weapons. I mean, doesn't matter what the cause is. There's no justification for it. It's just plain outright murder. So, yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer to condemn it. And anyone who fears it because of some political backlash, well, that's not particularly courageous, to say the least.
No, the longer it goes on, the longer they have that silence there, the more they stand condemned. Let's go to The Voice. We can't forget, of course, the vote is on Saturday. Polling out from the No campaign. This is Resolve Polling Group polling. Shows that the most convincing argument, the one that's turning Australians against The Voice, is that they don't want to divide the country. Now, one of the big No campaign financiers, Simon Fennick, he's made the point that corporate Australia have gone too far in backing this financial political campaign. This is not the job of corporate Australia. We'll get to some of the polling you revealed yesterday. I think that's really important as well. But where does the PM stand here on Sunday morning if these polls are accurate, if it's a thumping defeat of his voice? What happens next?
Well, I think Australians will be looking at how he reacts, because I expect a roughly 60-40 result for no. So he can't blame the electorate. He shouldn't blame the media, as he appeared to do on Insiders on the weekend, suggesting that. I mean, in a way, you can have a bit of a lash at Peter Dutton, but you've got to almost blame yourself, don't you, for not doing more to get it over the line, so, or to get it closer.
Well, basically, otherwise you're saying that Australians are stupid or they're racist.
Yeah. So, yeah, I would suggest that they've been working for several weeks on a strategy of what he should say, Peter. Wouldn't you agree?
I reckon you're right. Whether it cuts the mustard with the Australian electorate, now they've had a good look at this bloke and realise that he's just patently not across the detail. I just want to pick up that point about National Security Committee. I am surprised. I thought Peter Dutton might have been out in a limb today, that there might have then been quick confirmation for the Prime Minister's office that in fact they have had an NSC meeting. I am surprised that they haven't had one. I'll say they haven't had one because he says he will not comment. That tells me that he probably hasn't had the meeting. You can do this stuff remotely now. There's lots of secure ways they could have had a hookup, particularly given the impact we're worried about here in Australia with the Jewish community. Are you surprised, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I reported this yesterday. There hadn't been a meeting yet, and I was surprised. So, definitely. I mean, look, you can sort of achieve the same things, but the consensus amongst people who've done these jobs before is it's better to have all the officials, all the key ministers in a room, and you can make sure, as the Prime Minister, that everyone's doing everything they should when it comes to the security of Jewish sites, Jewish schools, what to do in the event of a protest or in the event of violence. Are the agencies doing their work? Is the cooperation on with state governments to make sure police are prepared for any sort of horrific attack that comes out of this? We just have to hope it's all happening outside the province of an NSC meeting, I guess.
Hey, just quickly, I forgot to mention that polling, we referenced it, but 22 only out of 151 federal seats on the tracking, we're told will vote yes. That's a walloping for the Prime Minister's Voice campaign. How accurate do you reckon that poll is?
Well, we'll find out Saturday night, but it is based on methodology which was very successful and accurate that the Australian and YouGov used for the 2022 election. They came up within a couple of seats of the result. And I remember Scott Morrison kind of poo-pooing it then. It's a different firm, it's Focal Data, but they've done the same thing. They've done a large nationwide survey. That's come in at 61.39, which is similar to the news poll. And then they've used the demographics for that to lots of data from the respondents to come up with the seat by seat. That's exactly what YouGov and the Australian did. And to me, a lot of these results simply make sense. I think I had a Nationals MP who suggests that it might be 5% out in their seat, for example, and there'd definitely be a 7, a no with 70 in front of it on Saturday night. Seats like Grainler and Kingsford Smith and Melbourne, and these are inner city seats, Clark, that are on there as yes, makes sense. Everywhere else going no, when you look at the national result, also makes sense. But if this is borne out on Saturday night, it is very devastating. And the only comfort that Anthony Albanese can take is at this point, the news poll nationally ain't going with it. It does seem like voters will vote no, but will forgive Anthony Albanese for taking a proposition they didn't like at the moment. The problem with these things, as you know, Peter, is they can hang around in the background if something misfires in your government in the next year and a half, and then it piles on top in terms of a judgment issue.
And depends how he handles any loss and how quickly he gets back on to what they regard as core business.
Yes.
Andrew, thank you. I'll
Has
see
to
you
be gracious.
Saturday night here at Sky News from 5 o'clock. All right, let's go now to Israel. We're joined by Israeli diplomat Mark Sofer, who most recently served in Australia as Israel's ambassador here between 2017 and 2020. Mark, thank you for your time. I know it's a horrific time for you personally, but for Israelis and people like me who are not of the Jewish faith but have enormous admiration for what you've achieved in your country, and our hearts go out to you. What's the latest over there?
Well, thank you for those warm words, Peter. Well, we're still, of course, reeling from the utter shock, the unadulterated shock of the carnage of the massacre of upwards of 1,000 people going around their daily lives. The people in a party, whole villages completely eradicated, and almost nobody in this country, which isn't a big country, as you know, it has been unaffected either by family member killed or abducted, or close personal friend, etc. Right now, as you know from your news reports yourselves, the troops, 300,000 reservists have been called up and are massing on the border of Gaza. And worry is also around about the what may happen in the north of Israel through the Iranian masterminded and proxy of the Hezbollah. But one thing I must say, Petra, and this is very important, what you do feel at the same time with the horror and the shock is a deep and unparalleled resilience, a unity that we only, we have come rarely together before, and that this is what we will win. And there will be a strategic change in the Middle East, in the southern part of Israel. We'll have a strategic change, not a tactical change, not just another skirmish, not just another operation or an interaction, but a strategic change of what was, will never be again.
Talk to me about the government, the opposition, or the parties in the Knesset, because I think this is very important. We've watched some scenes in recent months of disquiet about judicial changes. But given the horrors of what happened on the weekend and the threat, you're right, Gaza at one end, but in the north, obviously the Hezbollah border of what you possibly could confront, have the politicians responded and come together?
Well, I think it's you're correct. The last 9 months or 10 months since this government's come to power has caused a great deal of disunity. I can even talk on my own behalf. I've been very active and vociferous on the anti-governmental nature of what they have done. The government has done to cause disunity over the judicial overhaul. There's no other word for it. It's not a reform, it's an overhaul, and it's caused enormous split in Israeli society. But that was. Now the situation is completely and utterly different. It's not just a question of Israeli politicians, it's a question of the Israeli public, of the body of the man and woman in the street. There is total and utter unity. Everybody is unified, and we do expect some sort of emergency government, and I stress emergency rather than national unity government, emergency government to manage the war, because the feeling is also among leaders of the opposition, also among members of the public, that this particular government is unable or will not be able to manage this horrendous situation on its own, without the experience of former chiefs of staff that exist in the opposition parties. So the political situation will stabilise for the next period of time while the war is going on. But of course, what will happen afterwards is anyone's guess.
Help us understand, if you have troops on the borders, the reservists are all called up, and I say this for people at home, these are young Israeli young people. I mean, they are, you know, children that you and I would know, young people that have all been trained as required under national service. They are now in uniform with a very, very heavy burden. If you've got troops at the border, if there is this blockade on Gaza, what happens next in terms of basically annihilating Hamas as a continuing threat, but all the hundreds of hostages, their threats today too, that they will start literally executing. They're saying they'll do it on camera in the Islamic State style, executing hostages for every missile strike.
Well, this is, of course, a major and deep dilemma, not just for Israel, would be for any country in the international community. The balance of the need to cause the strategic change, to make sure that the Hamas will never, ever be able to even think about carrying out such atrocities in the future, and weakened to some extent that they may not, hopefully won't even exist anymore as an entity. And on the other hand, the deep worry for the hostages. I don't think there are hundreds, but I certainly over 100, and they have been pulled out of their beds. We're not talking about just people. We're talking of little babies, elderly women pulled out of their beds in the middle of the night, thrown into cars, and driven over the border, and probably sequestered into areas which the beasts, there's no other word for it, or the Hamas believe are safe, underneath hospitals, in mosques, in some sort of tunnel system that they've built up there as human shields. So there's a lot of psychological warfare coming out of the Hamas. We have to manage that, but at the same time never lose the direction that this is a war, and the two need to be balanced. So I don't envy the decision makers, but I do hope indeed that they will reach the end game, which everybody in Israel is united about, as I said.
And the world stands with you. Mark Sofer, thank you. Right, coming up after the break, we'll talk to a legal expert about more concerns in relation to the voice putting our entire system of government in jeopardy, plus the reaction of Jewish leaders in Australia to what we've seen unfold in Sydney. And of course, a protest due in Melbourne tonight. We've got cameras there. I'm keeping an eye on it. If anything happens, I'll bring it to you live. Coming up, we'll speak to a top barrister about why the voice is a Trojan horse, and your opinion there on legal consequences if it gets up on Saturday night. But let's go now to how Australian Jews are coping at the moment, given those protests we saw in Sydney last night, and of course protests too tonight in Melbourne. Joining me now from Sydney, the Co-Chief Executive Officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Alex Rivkin. Alex, thank you for your time. I seem to be saying this to all my Jewish friends who come on the program. I am sorry that you are living through these circumstances, not just what's playing out, of course, in Israel, but what your community is feeling here in Australia. I think as Australians, I say this, I am ashamed to see those scenes on our streets last night. I couldn't fathom this morning, as I watched it all play out, how on earth the police had allowed this protest to move from the Sydney Town Hall area and go down to the Opera House. I thought this is just going to spark a confrontation. Surely supporters of Israel, not just Jews, but many others would be down there trying to seek some solace in the moment that the Opera House was lit up. We find out today that there was no approval for this protest, yet the police were arresting a man with a Jewish flag, an Israeli flag, yet the bile and the venom coming out from the protesters about your community was allowed to continue, and not one protester, pro-Hamas protester, arrested.
We're asking these very questions, Peter. And first of all, thank you so much for your kind words of solidarity. They mean a great deal to us at this time. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, the whole thing was a mess. It was bungled. It's one thing to permit people to assemble and to protest in a free society, but there was absolutely no reason why they needed, as you said, to march from Town Hall to the Opera House. And what it did was it created a scene which is frankly a national embarrassment, where you now have images projected around the world of this rabble of vicious men chanting and lighting flares and calling for the gassing of my people at the footsteps of our most iconic monument. It's abhorrent. It's an appalling situation. It should never have happened. And it's really compounded the grief and the suffering of our community at this time.
You're right to point out that those images have gone around the world. I've been contacted by people I know overseas. They're basically saying, what the hell's going on in Australia? We had the police minister, New South Wales police minister, out on radio today. Have a listen to what she said.
Have you spoken to the Jewish community today?
No, I haven't spoken to them today, but I did speak to them several times yesterday and on Sunday.
Do you think you probably should have picked the phone up today and offered your support as the police minister as a result of what we saw last night?
Well, I'll certainly be speaking to them about their vigil that they're having later in the week, just, to ensure that we have security there for that as well, have the police there. But look, the Jewish Board of Deputies...
Given she was forced to admit that there was no approval given for this protest, given that yesterday we didn't know what they were going to say, today we know what they said, to not call anyone from the Jewish community, I find that extraordinary.
Well, like I said, the whole episode has been a mess. My colleagues at the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies have been in very close contact with the Premier and his office, and the Premier has been incredibly supportive, including agreeing to illuminate the Opera House in support of the Jewish community in the State of Israel. But I think to a large extent, everyone in the government and in the police has been perhaps blindsided by the extent of the venom and the hostility that we've seen. I think people underestimated that so many people, so many of our fellow Australians would be moved to protest in support of mass atrocities committed abroad. And I think that's taken everyone a little bit by surprise.
I think you're being kind there, Alex, because we saw a preacher very clearly on camera in Greenacre on Sunday night in Tony Burke's own electorate. I might add, Tony Burke, the federal MP, frontbencher, has not directly condemned that preacher. I think that would have said to anyone in a security intelligence agency, if they're doing that in Greenacre on Sunday night, we better be on notice across Sydney the following night, particularly given the Opera House. But I reported here last night on the show, Alex, the line coming out from officials that it's the Jews who needed to stay home. The Jews had to stay home.
And that's perhaps the saddest, most repugnant aspect of all this, that the mob has prevailed. That the ones who are threatening and harassing and spreading racial hatred in our streets were able to hold the day. And peace-loving citizens of the Jewish community were told to keep out of our own CBD. Jewish Australians from Sydney weren't able to access our own city centre. It's an extraordinary state of affairs.
Are you getting enough support for security around your schools and synagogues? Are people feeling safe in their suburbs?
Well, it's a very difficult time, and speaking to a lot of my friends and family in the community, people are afraid. And seeing these scenes of people chanting, "Gas the Jews," these enthusiasts for mass rape and murder, it has spooked and frightened the community. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we've been dealing with security challenges of various varieties for a long, long time. I don't have to tell you about the state of our schools and our synagogues and the security measures that are permanently in place. No. We face threats on a regular basis, most of which aren't reported in the press. But we're confident in our ability to secure the community. We're confident in the police as well. But as I said, I think we've all been somewhat startled by the depth of loathing and hatred in our midst from our fellow Australians.
I'm sorry to say, Alex, I've had plenty of security briefings about the situation in your schools and the level of hate in the community, but I was surprised to see what I saw in Australia at the Opera House last night, so I can only imagine how your community must feel. Thank you for your time tonight. Horrific stuff does not belong in Australia. Let's go to The Voice. Any wonder it's tanking? We do not want to be divided by race in this country, and that scene last night is a reminder that this does not belong in Australia. You'll remember last week we were joined by law professor at Sydney at University of Queensland, Nicholas Aroney. He was concerned that The Voice will give the Commonwealth what he regards as incredible power. He says it could even create a new head of power, and it could upend the way the Constitution has worked over the last 100 years or so, blurring the lines between the state and federal responsibilities. Well, he's not the only one. More legal experts have come out to say there are significant issues with the proposals. One of them is Philip Walker SC. He's been practicing law and everything else for about 35 years and plenty of time defending government laws and decisions. Philip joins me now. Thank you for reaching out, Philip. I think your opinion is extraordinary because, you know, we've all focused on the early part of the referendum question. You've had a good look at the third paragraph. Now, you say this is a real concern, and this is the line, I'll read it out for people at home. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. What concerns you, Philip, about that statement?
Peter, like everybody else, I was listening to the media and saw the first two statements, the establishment of the voice and then the representations that it could make. But the third statement raises a real question. What exactly is meant by conferring a power on the Commonwealth to pass laws with respect to matters relating to the voice in relation to its functions and powers? When I saw that, I thought, what does that mean? So I went to the explanatory memorandum, which the government prepared along with the legislation to change the Constitution. And in the explanatory memorandum, it refers to the representations that the voice may make as its core responsibilities. And then it refers to the fact that the Parliament may provide the voice with further functions and then confer powers on it to implement those particular functions. And that raised a further question, because when our Parliament has power to make laws on a subject, it also has power to delegate the ability to make laws. There are many laws that are made not just by Parliament, but they're delegated to ministers or the Governor-General, and they make regulations or ordinances. And I asked myself the question, if the Parliament can add functions and powers to the voice, why couldn't it delegate the power to do so to the voice itself? And when I then went back to the... So let me just
jump in there, Philip.
Sure.
So is your concern that the way it's constructed in that question, and I guess it's so open-ended, High Court interpretation, but the voice could end up at like the power to make regulations?
Yes, that's a question which nobody has seemed to answer because nobody seems to want to talk about what actually it will do and how it will work in detail. But that is my concern, that there may be a wide range of functions which could be conferred by Commonwealth legislation with a wide range of powers, and some of those could be delegated itself. Now, whether you regard that as good or bad is a matter for the individual person, but it's not something which is being discussed in the public debate because it's all centred around the first two paragraphs, not the third paragraph. And when you read the Solicitor General's opinion saying that the power the Commonwealth has under the third paragraph is very wide, then you wonder whether, in fact, this is in fact authorised. It may, for example, authorise... go on.
I was just going to say it's really interesting when I was talking to people in... You go, Philip.
I'm sorry. It may authorise inquiries, for example, with the power to subpoena people or to request documents. It may even authorise functions in relation to things like heritage, with perhaps laws made with respect to those topics. This is not clear, but one asks oneself the question, why are those powers put in the third paragraph to the constitutional amendment? And they do seem consistent with the reference in the Uluru Statement of Heart about joint sovereignty.
Well done on drawing our attention to this. That is a comprehensive opinion. You're right. I think that third paragraph has sort of gone through to the keeper, but we're, nowadays away from voting. It's good that you brought it to our attention. Thank you, Philip. I was just going to make the point that I keep hearing around Canberra that not only will the Voice members, if it gets be paid the sort of salaries of a backbencher with a backbencher's office, but they were looking for space in the Parliament House building to basically create a chamber for the voice. Now, that stacks up with Philip's comments there that it could be passing its own legislation or regulations. All right, quick break. After the break, Michael Danby, Kosher Garda, a whole lot to get across, not just in Israel, but elsewhere. All right, Tuesday night's usually my international panel. There is a lot around. Let's get to it now. Kosher Garda, contributor at Sky News, of course, and former Labor MP and very proud Jewish Australian Michael Danby joins me tonight. Michael, we often cross to you in Israel, so I know on a personal level this is an extraordinarily difficult time. I'll get to the ins and outs of the politics over there, but this has rocked the Australian Jewish community, hasn't it?
And Jewish communities all over the world, and I think decent human beings all over the world, because the casualties are so heavy. 1,000 civilians murdered, most of them in their beds or bus stops or cars, and the sexual violence against young Israeli women by these Hamas crazy people. That's why so many people who are not necessarily fans of Israel, even Farid Zakaria and people like that, are so agitated about this. I saw on MSNBC they were having a go at Hamas. So it's the nature of what these beasts have done, a la Daesh and
yeah, it is. It is like
ISIS.
Islamic State. To me, I remember that all those security briefings about what was happening on Mount Sinjar to the Yazidi women. This is the new playbook in that part of the world. Help people understand this argument about moral equivalency. You know, the Palestinians have had their land stolen. I mean, there were Palestinian types out there today spewing this sort of rubbish. Help people understand the character of Hamas and that this is a terror organisation.
Hamas is an Islamist organisation very much like Daesh. It doesn't want compromise with Israel. It's not after this or that piece of land. There were negotiations under Presidents Obama, Clinton and Bush that would have given the Palestinians land for peace, but they're not interested in that. They have that Islamist vision of that only they should rule that whole geographic area. That's why these evil people in Sydney were chanting from the river to the sea. That's what it means. It's not a peace alongside Israel. It's peace instead of Israel, to terminate Israel.
Yeah.
And Hamas is, you can see by the nature of what they've just done, the nature of the organisation. It's unheard of,
horrific.
Treating women like this, pensioners, infants.
Is the world doing enough?
I think people are really in shock just because we haven't seen something like this in 50 years in that region or elsewhere. I think, when I've looked at what the reaction has been like in the last 48 hours, I would say roundly most people just condemn the barbaric, heinous, atrocious acts that have happened. And in this day and age of social media, we can see imagery that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I think that's going to stay with everybody for a long time. But there have been some notable other pockets. There's been those rallies like you covered in your previous segment in Sydney and Vancouver and New York City of people just cheering for this, which is kind of shocking, I think, to many. There's been a lot of conspicuous silence. So President Obama was silent for a full 12 to 15 hours and then sort of came out with a tweet. You have the Squad and the U.S. Congress that expectedly were silent and then came out with sort of a mealy-mouthed statement. So that's sort of been interesting. There have been some celebrities. They don't matter, but I think it provides an interesting insight. So Kylie Jenner has 500 million followers. She put out a tweet saying she stands in solidarity with Israel, and the amount of blowback she received, she had to delete that tweet, which I think tells us something about sort of where the mood of certain pockets of the world are. So it's a little bit all over the place, and I think that's hard for a lot of people to stomach when you contrast that with what we're seeing took place.
We're going to have a quick break and come back to this point, though, but I'll ask you now, the Labor Party too is torn on this issue, isn't it?
It is, and unfortunately there are some people that have traditionally bad attitudes on this. Bob Carr, I think Michael Daly, he's, apart from being a political bozo, he's the person who didn't tell the coppers to go and stop those people from going outside the Opera House. And as Alex pointed out on your program, now that image of those people is all around the world. What does it do to Australia? Michael Daly, pick your game up.
Quick break, we'll come back to you in a moment. Stay with us. All right, straight back to Michael Danby. How do you get the women and children, the hostages, out of Gaza?
Well, King Solomon gave people the choice of dividing the baby. We all saw that film Sophie's Choice about what you do with the two children who were going two ways when they came to the death camp. It's a terrible dilemma. Qatar has said that they will try and negotiate on behalf of the women and the infants. I doubt whether that will be successful given the nature of the people that you're up against, and you've seen it by what they did, particularly this incredible sexual violence against the young women at that rave party and subsequently in Gaza. It's so terrible, Peter. I'm glad most of even the social media aren't picturing that, but I think they just have to go in there. They made a terrible mistake with releasing 1,000 terrorists for Gilad Shalit. They'll have to go in there and take out the military headquarters, even knowing that they will kill innocent civilians.
I've got to leave it there. Michael, thoughts and prayers with the Melbourne Jewish community and the Jews around the world.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, that's it for me. Andrew Bolt's up next.
Sorry.